So we're talking about beginner's mind, and my talk today is based on another Zen talk by Abbess Blanche Hartman. Her Japanese given name is Zenkai, I believe it's pronounced. She was a co-abbess at the San Francisco Zen Center, which is a very, probably the preeminent Zen center in this country. And she was also a student of the writer in the lineage of this writer, Shunryo Suzuki, who wrote about almost exactly 50 years ago, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, bringing Zen, really the key figure to bring Zen to the US and also to kind of bring that phrase, beginner's mind, sort of into the American lectionary, let's say. It's also known as Shoshin, as Hannah mentioned. That's the Japanese name for beginner's mind. It's one of his most famous ways of describing beginner's mind. He says, if your mind is empty, it is open to everything. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few. So beginner's mind has been referred to as the mind that is innocent of preconceptions and expectations and judgments and prejudices. Beginner's mind is just being present, simply being just there to explore and observe and see things as they are without a lot of mental baggage attached to it. You might say a beginner's mind is somewhat like the mind of a small child. I like to think of how maybe toddlers are at the first time that they go to the beach. If you've ever seen that, it's really fun to see a child experiencing wind and sand for the first time, all the textures, the wet sand versus the dry sand, and touching things and shells and rocks and other beach debris, and the motion of the waves of the tide coming back and forth, splashing in the water, knowing that all of these experiences are so rich and so new and so exciting. But you know, as we grow up, we lose that, right? We lose it. So the beginner's mind is really attaching to that wonder and amazement that a child might experience. You know, when I think of beginner's mind, I also think of puppies. I have a foster puppy right now. His name is Teddy. And much of the world through his eyes, but particularly his mouth, is exciting and new. He, at this stage, explores the world through his mouth by chewing on the laptop cord. He's learning how to run and to leap, but he's not always successful. There are times he tries to jump on the couch, but just bounces off the side because he's a beginner. Teddy is also, the puppy is also very much a beginner with stairs. There are 3 stairs going from my back door to my back patio. Teddy has no problem going down the stairs, but we've had to work on going up the stairs. He wants to start from the side at the 2nd step where he cannot get up. So I have to keep redirecting him. No, we start at the 1st stair and we work our way up that way. And then one day I discovered Teddy had actually gone underneath the stairs and popped up between the 2nd and 3rd step and got stuck. So yes, stairs are not his strong suit. I didn't know whether to push him down or to pull him through, but we finally figured out and Teddy got out of his step predicament pretty safely. And the problem kind of compounded since we lost power, and a friend with a small apartment, but with power, agreed to take me in, as well as 4 dogs, my 2 dogs and my 2 foster puppies. But her apartment was on a 2nd floor. And there was one staircase, one tall full-story staircase leading right up to her apartment. It had a railing, but all the steps, you know, there was air between all the steps. And Teddy was having none of this. I carried him up for about 2 days. I carried him up and down the stairs. But on the 3rd day, he decided he was going to try to go down and up the stairs with me having him on a leash. And he did it. It was agony. You could see he was terrified, and every paw, he just gripped the stairs like it was life or death. But he finally did it. And I think the lesson to us as a beginner like Teddy is that having beginner's mind can make us feel vulnerable, like we don't know things. It can make us afraid. And I think that's sometimes why we as human beings and ignore it. You know, we don't want to go to that place where we're vulnerable and things are scary all, you know, at the beginning. We don't want to give up all of our confidence and knowledge we are sure of to be like a scared puppy going up and down the stairs. So anyone here who has had a toddler knows about that stage. When they start to begin to talk, he'll say, "What's that? What's that? What's that? What's that?" That's another way of thinking about beginner's mind. What if we as adults, it would be annoying if we walked around all day saying, "What's that?" But what if we took on this capacity to just look at our lives, look at everything like it's fresh and new and think, what is that? What is that really? Just seeing what we see and being curious about it without any expectations or preconceived notions. But, you know, that's really hard, right? I fail at that thousands of times a day, because eventually as children, we lose our beginner's mind and we become people, the people our society, our culture wants. We become people who know stuff, right? That's really valued, knowing stuff. It's kind of essential to kind of maybe having a job and getting on with life. But it's when we've decided we know stuff, that's where all the trouble begins. That means we start to shut ourselves off to new possibilities. And this is a big loss that comes with this. Being awake, really awake to everything that is happening in our lives, the newness of every moment, I mean, that ends up taking a back seat to all of the great knowledge we believe we have accumulated. Knowing stuff creates problems. It can lead to disappointment when we expect one thing and get something else. Or if we have an idea of something we should like, and it turns out to be something not like that at all. And instead of just taking it in, you know, instead of just taking it in, we judge experiences. When actually we could just look at what this experience and say, that's interesting. Instead of going through the cycle of disappointment or frustration or letdown. Because these letdowns and frustrations are totally manufactured in our brains by us setting these expectations and not just living with life as it is. It's a mind game we actually play on ourselves that makes us unhappy. So the very nature of a beginner's mind is not knowing, not being an expert. Again, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. As an expert, you've got it all figured out, so you don't need to pay attention to what's happening, right? You know everything already. And that's a real shame. You miss a lot that way. So how do we go about getting a beginner's mind? This mind that is free to just be awake to what is going on around it. Well, of course, the Zen masters will tell you it's the way to get to this beginner's mind is through meditation. Because in meditation and sitting with the busyness of our minds, we start to realize this busyness and analyze it and kind of see what's going on. It becomes conscious to us. We start to see that all of these rigid views we carry. And once we see all these preconceptions and rigid views, I mean, that's the key. Once we notice them and can identify them and realize we're just carrying unnecessary baggage in our consciousness, then we're finally able to let them go, you know, as we confront these things. And it's easier to go in our minds, well, you know, instead of being so certain in these rigid ideas, we can go, well, maybe so, maybe not. One Zen master has said the essence of Zen is the phrase, not always so. Not always so. It's a good phrase to remember when you feel really certain about something. So you might have the ability to be open to other possibilities. If what I'm thinking may not always be so, my thought process may grow. So I love this story I heard in the yoga studio from one of my yoga teachers telling me about what her yoga teacher told her. When my yoga teacher would do a yoga pose she didn't like, and she'd complain about it and be like, oh, I hate this pose, I hate this posture. The teacher would say, transcend your preferences. And I love that, right? We spend so much time like rank ordering what we like in categorized order. Are we like this, or we don't like that? Or we like this food and we don't like that food, that we miss out on so much, because it's pretty much the time We transcend the times we've transcended our preferences and tried something new or gone outside our comfort zone. I mean, that's when we grow and learn and we can actually have great experiences. So I invite everyone to kind of play around with that phrase, transcend your preferences and see where it takes you. And I'd love to hear where it does and what you learn from it. Preferences are also just things that exist in our minds and may or may not even be true. So another way of describing beginner's mind is that it's the kind of mind that is not already made up. It's a mind that's just investigating, open to whatever happens, a mind that is curious, a mind that seeks, but is not caught up in expectations and outcomes, just being ready to take in what happens in the moment. And you know, this is such a countercultural idea. This is completely opposite of what we are taught to be in our Western civilization. In our Western civilization, we are taught to be consumers. We are taught to acquire things, not only just things, but we acquire ideas and knowledge and opinions. We are encouraged to get what we want. We are just encouraged to get and get and get, instead of having a mindset of curiosity and non-judgment. And we kind of fall into this pattern because we're taught and conditioned that way, this pattern of having or getting or acquiring. You know, I want this, I'll get this. I want the next thing, I'll get that thing. I want this. You know, if I only had this, you know, we do a lot of that. And it's an endless cycle that is concentrated just on getting, whether it's tangible things or intangible things. And, you know, this cycle is a trap because it never ends. It's being like on this hamster wheel or this treadmill of just wanting and getting and wanting and getting. And Buddhist masters will tell you that when you sit in meditation regularly, you start to realize about this cycle and how destructive it is, how much judgment is bubbling just beneath the surface of your mind, how much expectation and preconceived ideas we carry around all the time, and how all of this mental spinning we do, all this extra baggage, it's just a big distraction that keeps us from living our lives and noticing what's going on in the here and the now. So when we're able to notice and identify all these thoughts and all this extra mental baggage through meditation, we can begin to release it. Then we have the energy to actually pay attention to what's going on outside our brains. And this is the way, it's a release of this mental baggage that allows us to live in the moment and approach the world with a beginner's mind. You know, we human beings have a lot of mental baggage. I know myself included. You know, we have these stories, often from childhood, that we've carried around stories about ourselves, stories about others. We've got stories about the stories we are carrying. We've got all sorts of characters in these stories. And if they exist in real life, if you've asked this character in your story about this story, they probably have no idea what you're talking about because the story only exists in your mind. But walking around with all these stories, you know, the biggest tragedy is that they're keeping us from living our lives. And they're usually not really entirely true, or they're exaggerations, or they're overreactions to things that happened a long, long time ago, or that we were told a long, long time ago, and it really does not matter. So one of the goals in Zen is to approach everything with a beginner's mind, with an open mind, with a mind that is questioning and looking and listening and hearing and seeing and feeling and smelling without prejudgment, without preconception, and without fixed viewpoints. It's about being open and ready to see what is right in front of us. Open and ready to say, like a toddler, what's this? What's that? What's this? And be ready to see what is there and let it simply be what it is. So I'm going to quote directly from the Abbess Blanche Hartman now. This is some good stuff. Part of the beginner's mind is that it allows you to become your authentic self. Once you get rid of all that baggage, what's underneath is you, right? So she says, how will we open up this authentic you in the midst of all the accumulated fixed views that we carry about? We just have to notice them and let them go, and let them go, and let them go, and let them go, and let them go. She tells a story. She says, a monk visited his teacher, and his teacher said, "What have you been studying?" He replied, "I haven't even been studying." Well, the teacher asked, "What have you been practicing?" The student replies, "I haven't even been practicing the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism." Well, then the teacher, knowing that one of the four stages of a student of Buddhism is joy, he asked the student, "Well, are you joyful yet?" And the student says, "It would not be right to say that I'm not joyful. Through my practice, it's as if I found a pearl in a pile of dung." And that's what it's like, you know. There's all this stuff that we drag around with us, but the pearl is right there. What we need to do is free the pearl and let it gleam. In her poem, When Death Comes, Mary Oliver has a few lines that say, "When it's over, I want to say I have been a bride married to amazement. I've been a bridegroom taking the world into my arms." That is beginner's mind. Just knowing how amazing the world is, how amazing our life is, how amazing that the sun comes up in the morning or that the wisteria blooms in spring. A bride married to amazement, a bridegroom taking the world into my arms. Can you live your life with that kind of wholeheartedness, with that kind of thoroughness? This is the beginner's mind that we can work to cultivate. With practice, particularly meditation, we can eventually see where we are stuck with fixed views and see if we can let those rigid fixed views go. This is our effort. This is our work. Just to be here, ready to meet whatever is next without expectation or prejudice or preconceptions. Just what is this, I wonder? That's all there is to it. So please cultivate your beginner's mind. Be willing to not be an expert. Be willing to not know. So that's what the abbess has to tell us. And I think, like a lot of Zen ideas, they are absolutely timeless. They worked 2,000 years ago, and they can even work today with us in a world that is so vastly, almost impossibly different. But I wanted to look at this idea in a more contemporary light. How is it particularly relevant to us today? And I found this really good description of that. There's a writer named Jim Owens, so he's not necessarily a master or a monk, but he writes on a Buddhist blog. And this really struck a chord with me in terms of relevance for today. He says, "We all have a worldview, but humans, imperfect as we are, have a tendency to look for things that affirm rather than challenge what we believe. We presume often to know the intentions of others who hurt or overlook us. We accept limited amounts of information as sufficient to make judgments about the character of politicians, priests, and yet even poets and writers." That's all about the confirmation bias, you know, our society is experiencing right now, and the struggles about finding what is really true. We often, even if we're not conspiracy theorists, we're often operate on limited information. So he continues, "In short, we know what we know, even when we often have little more than second hand, third, or even more distant knowledge about a particular person or circumstance. And that knowing can slowly, subtly imprison our hearts and our minds. This knowing fertilizes the soil of our anger, our despair, our prejudice, and our resentment. But what if we could become beginners? What if we developed a healthy skepticism for our own point of view?" I'll add, that's really hard. What if we could polish the lens through which we see the world? That doesn't mean we have to abandon our principles. It doesn't mean we have to become emotional or physical punching bags for those who would harm us. But if we could let go of those expert ideas, the things that are buried so deeply within us we can barely recognize them, what then? Would we be kinder? Would we be slower to anger? Would we grant compassion to friends, family, and even strangers if we could set aside our expertise for just a moment? Perhaps we might have conversations with people about ideas rather than jab our fingers in the faces of those with whom we disagree. Maybe putting aside our knowing would allow us to see new possibilities. We might then clearly see our own gifts and how they can serve humanity while allowing us to experience profound satisfaction. We might see new options for how we work or even why we work. We might solve problems in our homes, relationships, or at work we previously thought unsolvable. We might make friends of enemies as we learn to view conflict as the chance to evaluate ourselves rather than to judge one another. That's a really hard one. We might make friends of enemies as we learn to view conflict as the chance to evaluate ourselves rather than to judge one another. We might even find it within ourselves to be healed of the wounds and discouragement we experience. A beginner's mind allows us an openness, the possibility of joy, and immense gratitude that I suspect isn't possible for many experts. So that's the end quote of Mr. Owens. So my final message to you all today as Unitarian Universalists is to try beginner's mind on for size. Now that can be a big stretch for the typical UU because we are very attached to our learning and knowledge. We are very attached to our critical thinking, and those are not always things. We can also become quite attached to our opinions and our judgments. In fact, if there is idolatry in Unitarian Universalism, it's probably our opinions that are our false idols, myself included in all of this. But beginner's mind asks us to step out of that frame of thinking, into a new zone, not a comfort zone, but in a discomfort zone. Right? This zone where we don't know everything. All of our confidences we have built up in our minds have been taken away. So we're kind of like Teddy the foster puppy on the stairs. We are in scary and vulnerable territory when we do that, but it's worth it. Because beginner's mind is also the gateway to living our lives more fully and more in the moment, and getting out of our heads and into our lives, and putting a stop to our minds getting in the way of this inherent peace and joy that we are born with, that we all have within us, but that gets buried under so much mental baggage. So let's work towards locating, like the pearl in the dung, locating that inherent peace and joy we all have within us. May it be so, and blessed be.